This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is 1604 in London. A discovery is made in the vaults below the building where the king and his family will gather for an important presentation to court. The king is James I of England, James VI of Scotland. He is the beginning monarch that understands the challenge ahead of him is to deal with a country that is both rich and divided by religion, divided by government, divided by region, divided by the vicissitudes of nature. And I now turn to Jonathan Healey. His new book, The Blazing World, A New History of Evolutionary England, 1603 to 1689, introduces James I as a way of understanding what we remember in America as the English Revolutionary times. Very violent, extremely difficult to generalize about, and leading to the glorious revolution that was the sponsor of peace and stability in the 18th century. And the imperial project then became serious, the building of the great British Empire. Jonathan is an historian. He's an associate professor in social history at Oxford University. Jonathan, congratulations and a very good evening to you. The Gunpowder Plot, remember the 5th of November, the attempt by a small group of men, Catholics, to destroy James I. Why? What was their motive? And what did James make of it? Good evening to you, Jonathan.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for having me on. The Gunpowder Plot, it's something that it's one of those events that in the UK we all remember, because, as you say, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. The context was that at the end of the 16th century, at the end of the reign of Queen Elizabeth, England had moved away from Roman Catholicism, starting under Henry VIII. But that process had not been complete, in that there were many people who believed that it should go further, that there should be further kind of religious reform. And there was a small minority of people, the Catholics, who thought that the whole project was wrong for the start, and they were, hankering after a change back towards Rome. And when James I came to the throne in 1603, he had ruled Scotland for decades at this point. And he was faced with an England which was divided between, essentially kind of three groups. There's a sort of mainstream in the middle. There's a sort of Puritan faction who want further reform, and there's a sort of Catholic holdout who ultimately want to go back to Rome. And each of those groups in 1603 believes that James will be on their side. They each have hopes for this new ruler in the way that people often do. There's a new ruler. They think, well, they're bound to be on my side, aren't they? And gradually each side became disappointed with them. The Catholics by 1605 were disappointed that James hadn't taken the country back to Rome, and that then led a faction of them, a small group, into this extremely radical course, which was to try and, at the state opening of Parliament, to try and put a huge quantity of gunpowder underneath Parliament, and when the king was opening Parliament, to set it off and blow the whole building sky high, killing the royal family, killing most of the political nation, and they hoped setting off a Catholic revolution.
So here it is, 1605. The Gunpowder Plot has been discovered. The king is safe. And yet he begins now what we would call a purge of the Catholics. And that is comprehensive across his reign. It appears to be tyrannical, but at the time it's understood as just. That Gunpowder Plot and the king's reaction to it. My reading of the story you're telling, Jonathan, is that it informs all of the decisions that will take place for the next 80 years or so, right up to James II. Is that a fair reading, this paranoia that comes into the land?
It is, and it's the Gunpowder Plot, and what becomes the so-called Popish plot becomes a sort of a leitmotif. It's a recurrent theme throughout the whole period, and we'll sort of see we'll see recurrence of that as we go through. But amongst sort of mainstream opinion in England, there is a constant fear of a Catholic kind of, terror network, if you like, a Catholic network which is plotting to overthrow the government, and that is also associated with, not just kind of foreignness. It's associated with hostile powers like Spain and France, and the Vatican, but also with tyranny. The association amongst a lot of the English people in this period is that Catholic countries are more absolutist. The government is more arbitrary. There's more power given to Catholic monarchs, and that sort of goes against English liberties, which see power as being more diffuse, with more role for representative institutions. So there's a kind of political element to anti-Catholicism as well, but it becomes, as I say, a sort of recurring theme throughout the whole century.
You are a social historian, and it's important to identify now not just kings and queens, but the people who will make up Parliament. What is the middling sort? What does that refer to, and who were they?
Well, so with the Blazing World, one of the things I was trying to do is to unify political and social history, in that you get histories of this period, and they tell the story from from Whitehall, from the King's palaces, and you get social histories. They tell the sort of economic history of the period, and the history of sort of gender relations and things like that. All of this stuff is great, but what I'm trying to do is sort of bring it together. And one of the sort of deep themes, if you like, for the 17th century is that it comes at the end of a period of immense social change, whereby one group in society, what I call, following other historians, what we call the middling sort. We do that because we don't want to call them the middle class or the bourgeois, because it's slightly different. And these are sort of, kind of wealthy peasant farmers, basically, who have basically got enough land to feed themselves and sell off some of their produce and make loads of money from it, because the price of stuff is going up. And as a result of this wealth, these groups become more literate. They become more involved in the law. They are more likely to send their sons to the local grammar schools, and then to Oxford and Cambridge, and then the Inns of Court in London, where they learn the legal profession. And it's from that group that the majority of people who can vote come from. And some of those group members of the middling sort become very, very wealthy. They become members of the gentry, so they're even wealthier. And within this sort of wealthy middle gentry, these kind of middling kind of landholders, that's where the majority of people who sit in Parliament come from. So they are a landowning body, but also one with a lot of legal training, and a lot of literacy, and a lot of sophisticated thinking about politics and religion. And that becomes really, really important throughout the period.
James is recognizable as a monarch because he's always out of money, and he needs to deal with money. He said that he takes care of all of his relatives in Scotland, and then at the same time he's trying to build a fleet, and then at the same time he's dealing with the warring powers on the continent who want to get him involved, and he sees himself as a peacemaker. How does he get his money? What is the deal he makes with Parliament?
Well, this is another one of those kind of long-term structural problems which are happening in the 17th century, which is it comes at the end of a period of very, very long-running inflation. And what that means is that the state finds it very, very difficult to fund itself, because the cost of everything, especially war, is going up. It's the 16th century, early 17th century sees a sort of military revolution, where you basically get a kind of transition from bows and arrows and swords and stuff to much more sophisticated gunpowder weapons, big fortifications, big ships, and that this of course costs lots and lots of money. And the trouble is that the way that the state raises taxes is based on sort of nominal value, and that doesn't go up to keep up with inflation. So all states around Europe are struggling with this problem, and what that means is that the king is forced to constantly go back to Parliament, because there is a sort of a legal maxim, if you like. There's an understanding in the English common law tradition that, as a general rule, you can't tax the people without their consent, and that consent has to come from Parliament. But of course, James doesn't want to go to Parliament as too often, because they are fractious, and they're telling him, they're sort of telling him how to conduct his foreign policy, how to conduct his dynastic policy. So he tries to find new ways of funding the state which involve not going to Parliament, which don't involve going to Parliament. So yes, that becomes a sort of running problem. But the most sensible thing that James does when faced with this issue of leaky finances is that he simply tries to stay out of war. He realizes that the thing that's costing lots of money is these kind of continental adventures. So he wants to stay out of them. Which is fine until his son-in-law basically angers the Austrian, the Habsburg Empire, and ends up involved in a massive European conflagration.
The book is The Blazing World, A New History of Revolutionary England, 1603, 1689. We've had the peaceful parts. Here come the bumps. We're about to witness through all these regents and their parliaments the arguments that the founders will use to stand up to a king in the late 18th century. Standing to a king in the early 17th century was that much more difficult. James I is mostly a successful leader and king. He suffers from arthritis. He also has doubts about his ability to manage his household. We now need to introduce Charles, his son, the heir apparent, and a man named Buckingham. His name is George Villiers. There are rumors about the king and Buckingham having a relationship, but this is the kind of rumors that circulate around courts. So I want to go to an incident that's much more revelatory of the future for me. In 1622, I believe, my notes are inexact here. In 1622, the king is anticipating trouble on the continent, and he needs help. He needs some way to hold it off. And suddenly, Charles, the heir apparent, and Buckingham, the Duke of Buckingham, are charging off to Madrid to meet with the King of Spain. Jonathan, when I read this, I had to read it twice because it came out of nowhere. What were they thinking? What was their mission?
It is one of those kind of really sort of bizarre moments in 17th century history, and the immediate context is that in 1618 there is a rebellion in Bohemia, of all places, and what this does is it leads to Frederick, Elector Frederick of the Palatine, of the Palatinate, being placed on the throne of Bohemia. Now, that may seem very, a distant land of which we know nothing, but he just happens to be married to James I's daughter, Elizabeth Stuart. So when he then gets ousted he's a Protestant, he gets ousted by the Catholics. There's a big war in Europe, and in England, lots of church ministers are shouting at James and saying, "Look, this is good versus evil. This is Christ versus the Antichrist. This is Catholics versus Protestants, and you're either with us or you're against us. There is no neutrality. If you're not getting involved in this war, then you might as well be on the side of the Antichrist," which, of course, James is not particularly pleased about. But he's constantly thinking, well, okay, if I do have to get involved in a war, then I'm going to need money. And it goes back to what we were just talking about in the previous section, where, he's short of money. So one of his money-making schemes is to marry off his eldest son to the richest country in Europe, to a member of the royal family of the richest country in Europe, which is Spain at this point. So he has this plan to marry Charles to the Infanta of Spain, so the daughter of the King of Spain. Now, this is hugely unpopular in England because Spain is a big Catholic country. It's associated with the Armada. They're sort of the ancestral enemies. It's again hugely unpopular. But the negotiations kind of stalled, and in 1623. funnily enough, during a kind of big famine in England, big kind of food crisis, Charles decided, along with Buckingham, his father's favourite, that they would try and speed things along by disappearing over to France first, wearing false beards, traveling through France, through kind of really quite dangerous countryside, and then just turning up in Madrid, which they did. And Charles leapt over a wall to try and meet the princess, and she was horrified and terrified. And in the end, it didn't go anywhere, and they had to come back with their tails between their legs. And when they got back, there was huge celebrations in England. Everyone was delighted that this Spanish match had failed. It was said to be treason to be sober, because everyone was celebrating so much. But it's one of just a wonderfully kind of picaresque, kind of just bizarre element to the story. And the sort of longer term consequence of it, though, is that when Charles gets back, his father James is quite old now. He's not really as dynamic as he used to be. James is now really good friends with the most important politician in England, Buckingham, and they feel humiliated by Spain. So they are able finally to push James along this kind of path towards finally getting involved in this continental war, which of course costs money, and that's how his reign ends. It's sort of sad ending, really. The Rex Pacificus, this kind of king, the peacemaker, who ends his reign really kind of physically ill and bedridden, and knowing that his policy of making peace is in complete ruins.
Charles I, the king dies March of 1625. Charles I, at the age of 24, is now, to my reading here, maybe he's 25, maybe he's 26, he's in his mid-20s, is now the regent, when his first task is that I have from Jonathan's reporting, is that he has a £1 million debt to pay off. So he has to turn to Parliament right away. The book is The Blazing World, A New History of Revolutionary England, 1603 to 1689. Jonathan Healey is the author. To my reading as an amateur, the cases and the presentations and the passions in Jonathan's book will reappear as if by magic in the founders of the United States of America. And the arguments that are in the 17th century are still with us. I understand we've done a deal of learning since then, but the same idea of regents versus the people, and what is the correct way to govern. Is it for the safety of the people? Is it for the absolute power of the king? Is it somewhere in between? We go now to Charles I, a young regent, and his most important minister is the man he went dashing off to Spain with, Buckingham, who's in charge of the fleet. And yet that matter of money causes again and again the problems with Charles's early days of Charles's reign. He's trying to deal with Parliament. A deal here, I noted Edward Coke is still with us. He's a very aged man at this point. Do I have that correctly, Jonathan? He's still alive.
Yes, no, and Edward Cook is he's a man of a very interesting career path, former Attorney General to Queen Elizabeth, but who fell foul of James I when he was Lord Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, and he's now sort of in his older years. He's kind of reinvented himself almost as a sort of opposition politician, and he's one of the kind of leading figures in Parliament. He gets elected in Parliament in the 1620s, pushing for a sort of a kind of a restriction on the power of the monarchy, and he's very central behind the Petition of Right of 1628. So yeah, a very interesting career, and a man whose legal judgments still get cited in common law countries even today. Very interesting.
His grievances are, to my mind, inspirational to all the other remonstrances that we will talk about over the rest of the century. Because Edward Coke, everybody venerated him because you told me, you're right, that he was one of the richest men in England, one of the richest lawyers everywhere. He was extremely articulate, very passionate. And his grievances against the king are a watchword for what happens next, which I take as a blow to Charles, but a blow to the regency. Buckingham is assassinated by a man who doesn't have any relationship with any religious group, any understanding, any social movement. Why does John Felton kill Buckingham so foully?
Well, I mean, ultimately, he's upset. Felton was a soldier under Buckingham's command, and the late 1620s, which you know, I hope sort of come across in the book, it is a sort of formative and really exciting and really interesting and quite sort of intense period of political struggle, and it's all going on against the background of two very, very badly run continental military expeditions, one against Cadiz in Spain, which ends in disaster, followed by one to La Rochelle in France, where they are supposed to be relieving sort of Protestant rebels against the Catholic French monarchy, and it all just goes disastrously wrong. And they're both run by Buckingham, who's in charge of the navy, and they both fail because there's a lack of funds. But Felton is someone who has experienced this firsthand. He sees Buckingham as sort of incompetent military leader. There's also some evidence that, you know, he's described as distracted, so that there may be a sort of, you know, a kind of post-traumatic stress element to what's going on with him. But he also believes he should be promoted, and he hasn't been. So he then he's in London, he's lodging with someone, and he sees a copy of a parliamentary remonstrance against so like a sort of petition against Buckingham, and basically thinks, right, I have to do something about this. And so he buys a knife for you know, for a shilling, and then goes down to Portsmouth and stabs Buckingham when he's coming out of breakfast. But it's all in the context of the sort of late 1620s, where there's these wars going on which are unsuccessful. They're costing a lot of money. And what Charles tried to do in order to raise money without going back to Parliament, because by this point Parliament is sort of shouting at him about his religious policies as well. And whenever they meet, they say, we want to impeach Buckingham. This is the main thing we need to do. So Charles tried to raise money without Parliament. He did this by using something called a forced loan, where basically he says, you must lend me money. And you have no choice about this. And of course, I'll give it back to you. But everyone knows that he never will. And then when people refuse to do it, he has them imprisoned. And that then leads to questions about habeas corpus, about the right of the king to imprison people without trial, which is sort of where Edward Coke comes in, because he is, he sees these imprisonments and this extra parliamentary tax as being against the English common law, which says, you cannot be deprived of your liberty without a judgment of your peers, and taxation, the people can't be taxed without giving their consent to it. So it's a sort of, it's almost a kind of clash between a monarchy who needs money and is willing to do what it takes to get that money, and a legalist tradition whereby there are rules, and those rules give some basic protection to the people. And Coke kind of represents those, I think. He has a sort of bad reputation these days because he's absolutely terrible to his wife. And he's definitely not a particularly likable character, but that doesn't mean he's any less important. I think he's a very he's a very principled man in a lot of ways and has important principles.
It is the winter spring of 1629. Charles looks at Parliament. They oppose my taxes, they question my religion, and as far as he's concerned, they led to the killing of his favorite friend, the man who he rode to Spain with. They also challenge his understanding of how to be a regent. So he dismisses Parliament. It's gone, 1629.
Yeah.
And now we begin the debate of the personal rule. Jonathan, what is ship money? What is tonnage and poundage?
So these are both, they're both forms of taxation. Tonnage and poundage is basically a kind of customs. So it's on imports and exports. And traditionally Parliament would grant it to the king at the start of their reign for the length of the reign. For various reasons in 1625, they don't with Charles. They give it to him for a year, and he's very, very offended by this, but he continues to collect it anyway. So it becomes a kind of extra parliamentary tax. So it becomes very, very controversial. Now, ship money is another one, which, it's one of these things where it's quite hard for us as in the 21st century to understand how just how controversial this is. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in this book is to try and put us in the shoes of people in the 17th century and try and understand why this particularly kind of arcane sounding tax is such a big deal. And what it basically is it's a levy whereby traditionally the king can go to port towns and say, to protect the realm, you need to produce me a ship. And what he does in the 1630s is he says, okay, that's fine, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend it to places inland. So every county has to pay ship money. It makes perfect sense for an island, for a country which is surrounded by water. It makes perfect sense. The trouble is that legally, the ship money could only be levied in an emergency. And the question then becomes, is there an emergency in the 1630s? Now, Charles I says that there's loads of pirates, that's the emergency. And if there is, can the king decide whether or not it's an emergency, or does he have to call Parliament to decide whether or not there's an emergency? And what happens is there's this huge kind of legal case. It was in Westminster Hall. All 12 common law judges were involved. There was counsel on both sides. The King's Attorney General, a guy called John Banks, was arguing on his side and made kind of powerful arguments based on the law of necessity. And then a kind of hotshot lawyer called Oliver St. John was on the other side arguing against. And you'd have crowds coming down to Westminster to follow this lawsuit. And eventually the judges 7-5 declared in favor of the Crown, saying that this was legal. And funnily enough, this was a sort of a bad outcome really for the Crown, because most people were sort of a bit ambivalent about it. And the way they looked at it was, well, if they can declare that to be legal, then what else can they do? So the whole thing starts to look very arbitrary. But it kind of goes back to this fundamental question of whether you can tax the people without their consent. I mean, for want of a better phrase, it's a sort of there's no taxation without representation kind of thing, isn't it?
And that was immediately what I went to. Where have we heard that before? Now, Charles is going to rule personally, but he's also interested in culture. Well, we call culture. What he would have said was religion. There are two men, Archbishop William Laud and then the Earl of Strafford. Both of those men do the king's bidding. And I presume that all during this decade, they're hated by the former parliamentarians, by the Puritans, by the Presbyterians, by the dissenters, and by the well-to-do. Is that correct? They became anathema to them.
Well, I mean, there's certainly debate in that they definitely have their supporters. Strafford is interesting because he's a sort of, he's a man who will do what needs to be done, and it doesn't really matter how he does it. So in a context where there's kind of concern about the monarchy becoming arbitrary, not respecting the law, or perhaps even worse, doing things which are legally dubious and then bullying the judges to ratify them, which is what seems to happen with ship money. Someone like Strafford becomes particularly scary because he seems to be someone who's willing to do what it takes. Laud, on the other hand, he was someone who religiously had a much more, his view of the church was, much more focus on the beauty of holiness, much more focus on order, bowing at the name of Jesus, receiving communion at the altar rails, and wearing of elaborate surplices, that kind of thing. Much more sort of, it looked more Catholic, I suppose, to a lot of people. But worse than that is that he was someone who didn't want to have any kind of dispute about it, or any kind of discussion. His was the way, and you followed him. So it was all very well having these ideas, but if you allow people to dissent from them, then they're less problematic. But for him, he can't allow anyone to disagree with him, so he becomes very, very unpopular. In 1637, Charles tried to impose a new version of the prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer, on Scotland. and Scotland was much more Puritan than England at this point. And they opposed it. They created a sort of provisional government. They put an army in the field. And as a result of that, Charles's rule in England collapsed as well. And the first two people to be arrested once Charles had sort of lost power, lost control of the situation in England were Laud and Strafford, because they were unpopular, they were dangerous, and in Laud's case in particular, they were seen as being representative of this sort of popish plot, if you like.
The book is The Blazing World: A New History of Revolutionary England, 1603 to 1689. Jonathan Healey is the author. Jonathan mentions the Scottish Revolt, but that's the first of many rising up against the absolute power of the king. We need now to go quickly through the 1630s and the 1640s, because the king's power is challenged not only by religionists, but also by people who have been disappointed about his way of exacting penalties, exacting taxes, and what is in effect tyrannical. The word tyranny is used all the time. Jonathan, the fighting begins almost casually in the early 1640s with the king riding around with retainers, that is to say his private army traveling with him. At the time, there was no standing army. Is that correct? When the king needed men to fight with him, he'd call to his lords and they'd raise the army. So is the king understood to be, at this point, ordinary riding with his protectors, or is this seen to be a step back, a weakness on his part?
Well, I mean, he's if you like, the kind of Rubicon moment, if you like, is when in at the the winter of 1641, 1642, where essentially, so what's happened is that Charles has been forced to call Parliament. Parliament has pushed him down a sort of, a path of reform. As part of that, they have put William Laud in prison, and they've put Strafford on trial, and eventually had him executed against the king's wishes. The king wasn't able to do anything about it. And after that period of reform, which the king has basically sort of broadly been forced to accept, he then stages a bit of a fight back. He tries to build up his own party within Parliament, so that by the end of 1641, Parliament is basically split. There's sort of, reformists, future parliamentarians, and then there's royalists in Parliament. It's about sort of 50-50 split. And then it all comes to a head in the winter of 1641, 1642, where there's kind of huge street protests about the presence of bishops in the House of Lords. And as part of Charles's kind of fight back, he basically gathers an army around him of sort of loyal soldiers, mostly sort of demobilized soldiers who'd been part of the army which had fought against Scotland, but had then by this point been demobilized. And he sort of gathers them around him at the Palace of Whitehall, which is about sort of 300 yards away from the Palace of Westminster. Maybe a bit more. It's been a while since I've been down there. And he then he says to Parliament, right, okay, there's 5 of your members plus 1 member of the Lords, and they're the traitors who are kind of who are trying to overthrow me, and I want them to be arrested. And initially he sends his Attorney General into Parliament, and they are charged, but then Parliament says, no, you're not having them. So then the next day Charles came down to Parliament with a huge army of men and tries to pull them out by force, by which point they'd already fled. And after that, there's another great round of kind of street protests, and Charles is very frightened by this. There's one point where a sort of radical printer, is an ironmonger called Henry Walker, pushes into his coach and throws a pamphlet in which sort of says, "To your tents, O Israel." It's a call to arms from the Bible against tyrants. And Charles is terrified by this, and as a result, he then leaves London. Famously, so the story goes, he turns up at Hampton Court, just outside London, before he can tell anyone that he's getting there. So his whole family are forced to share a bed for the night. And then after that, he then goes on this kind of, this sort of sorrowful winter journey around the country, trying to gather support, which eventually he is able to do. And then he's able to put together an army. But it's that moment when he's forced out of London by the people of London, really, where he does become this kind of peripatetic, as I say, sort of rather sort of forlorn figure, traipsing around the country, trying to gather support.
My reading, Jonathan, it's backwards, I understand. We have about a minute here before we turn to the battles of the 1640s and the execution. My reading is that this challenge to the king was establish the ability over Strafford's, especially over Strafford's execution, establishes the idea that the king is not greater than we are, that we can push hard and he'll back down. Is that fair to say that's happening here? We have about a minute.
Well, yes, and one of the things that's quite interesting is that in the build up to the actual war, both sides are trying to raise supporters, and they do that by producing pamphlets and news books and things like that. And the royalists are sort of saying, you can't go against God, he's your anointed ruler. Whereas the parliamentarians are saying, well, actually, the people are sovereign, and if the king is acting tyrannically, it's the people's duty to rise up against him. And that that becomes an important principle, really, for the parliamentarian side.
Yes, they're called paper bullets.
Yes.
The 17th century had a poetic way of using English. All the phrases you quote are just wonderful. I think we could use all of these today. Jonathan Healey is the author. The book is The Blazing World, A New History of Revolutionary England in 1603 to 1689. It is now 1646. Charles I, the regent of England and Ireland, this is everything we understand the power of the king, surrenders to the Scots called the Covenanters because he's being pursued by the New Model Army led by Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. Jonathan, we go immediately to the personalities of these leaders of the New Model Army, because that will be determinative of this regicide upon us. What is the New Model Army, and what is Fairfax to it? What is Cromwell to it at this point? Thank you.
Well, the New Model Army was the attempt by Parliament to reorganize their forces, because they had found themselves in a sort of winning position in the Civil War that was that had taken place, and then they'd blown it. They'd made a mess of it, and they decided that part of the problem was that the commanders, particularly the Earls of Essex and the Earl of Manchester, were not sufficiently committed to full victory. They wanted to sort of, win the battles against the king and then go back to the negotiating table. Whereas actually what needed to be done was the king needed to be beaten completely in the battlefield. And Essex and Manchester were seen as being too wet, if you like. So Parliament basically had them fired, and put in their place commanders who were felt to be more effective and more committed and more dynamic. And they settled upon a sort of minor Yorkshire gentleman called Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was a perfectly solid general, politically fairly kind of non-committed, and therefore able to sort of unify various factions, and various other people, of whom the most important was the eventual commander of the horse, so the cavalry, Oliver Cromwell. Now Cromwell is a very interesting character, who's sort of middling kind of farmer from the east of England, and a very committed Puritan, but someone who had what we might as well call a kind of a more democratic approach to the military than was prevalent at the time, in that he didn't promote people based on their social status. He promoted people based on their commitment and their effectiveness. I would rather have a plain russet-coated captain, he said, that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows, than that which you call a gentleman and nothing else. The idea is that he wants people who are effective and committed. And they, in the field, Fairfax and Cromwell are a sort of, a bit of a dream team, really, and they are able to, with this effectively funded army, to chase the royalists from the battlefield. And the big kind of set piece battle is in the summer of 1645. It's at Naseby in Northamptonshire, where the royalists are routed. By early 1646, the king is in a desperate position. Eventually, his capital at Oxford is besieged by Fairfax. His army's falling apart. So he once again goes out, slips away in disguise, just as he had with Buckingham in 1623, and slips past the parliamentarian forces and makes his way up to Nottinghamshire, where he surrenders to the Scottish army, which is at that point providing support to the parliamentarians. The question then becomes, what kind of settlement comes next? But the military side of the Civil War has, at least for now, has ended.
There will be a second civil war.
It will.
In which the New Model Army takes the field again against Scots, led by a man named Hamilton. The Royalists form up to defend the king again. The battles continue, the bloodletting continues, but we're building to an understanding of Parliament asserting itself more and more with the New Model Army. And we need to understand why it was that Parliament believed so much in this challenge to the king. What was the end result? And that takes us to Parliament's thinking about what are called remonstrances. Remonstrances. Remember the grievances brought by Edward Coke against King James I. Well, Henry Ireton is an important player here who will die early in his life. But I discovered him through you, Jonathan. What does Ireton represent now? What do we learn from him and his remonstrances?
Well, what happens after the Civil War is that basically there are multiple attempts to try and make peace with the king. No one, or not very many people at this point really think, well, we should just get rid of the monarchy full stop and just have a republic. Most people think, well, we need to make some kind of peace. The trouble is that on the parliamentarian side, there are different visions of what that peace will look like, and they partly divide along religious grounds. So on the one hand, you have Presbyterians who are still, although they don't want bishops, they still believe in a fairly kind of, structured and socially conservative church. And then on the other hand, you have independents who are basically sort of Congregationalists, and they are much more sort of, much more interested in sort of religious toleration and much more sort of bottom up. And on those two sides, there are sort of different visions of where power lies between Parliament and the people. And then in 1647, because of this kind of conflict between Presbyterians and independents, the New Model Army engages in politics in a big way. It basically kind of marches to London. It occupies London, and there's a moment when a sort of conservative crowd invade Parliament and throw kind of street ordure in the speaker's face. And as a result of that, the New Model Army comes into London and restores order. And then at that point, they then start, the New Model Army then starts writing down its own constitutional thoughts and putting them to the king as a potential settlement. And the man who does this, the man who's most sort of central to writing down the constitutional thoughts of the New Model Army, is Henry Ireton. He's a minor gentleman from Nottingham. He's an associate of Cromwell. He eventually becomes Cromwell's son-in-law. And he's a very kind of profoundly sophisticated political thinker. The trouble is, from Ireton's point of view, is that in late 1647, he is outflanked from the left because in the aftermath of the Civil War, there's a sort of big movement in London and in the ranks of the New Model Army for democracy, for manhood suffrage, whereby all men would get the vote. And it sort of ends with these kind of set piece debates where the army says, right, okay, let's get everyone together and we'll discuss the future of the constitution. And they do this in a small town called Putney, just down the river from London. And you have on the one side the Democrats, the Levellers, and on the other side Henry Ireton, who is sort of saying, well, you know, we can't give democracy to people who don't have property because they don't have a fixed interest in the country. Anyway, whilst that's all going on, Charles the King escaped and managed to make a treaty with the Scots, who of course had been his enemies, and then they invaded England again, this time on the royalist side. The New Model Army was forced to take to the field again, and they defeated the King and the Scots once more. So that leaves them in a position where they are, so the end of 1648, they've been forced to fight again. Lots more people have been killed than were necessary, because the king won't sit down and agree to a peace treaty and a new constitution. So Ireton at that point becomes a sort of almost a kind of firebrand radical, pushing the idea that the safety of the people is the supreme law. Salus populi suprema lex. It's kind of Latin dictum. And as part of that, he writes this this kind of fiery remonstrance, basically saying, you know, the king must be brought to trial, otherwise the people are going to be ruined, because he will come back again with another army and there'll be another civil war. And it's that leads directly to you know, the sort of the central kind of moment in this century, which is the putting of the king on trial by representatives of Parliament.
It's 1649. The new model army is now a political actor of great power. Parliament is reduced. It's called the Rump Parliament. The trial of Charles Stuart takes place in Westminster Hall. It's an event that still resonates 4 centuries later. John Cook is the prosecutor, and the charge is murder, wanton murder. Charles refuses the plead, but they put testimony from witnesses on anyway because they want this to be a public trial. At this point, this is great risk they're taking. Are they aware of it, Jonathan, to kill the king?
Oh, hugely so, hugely so. I mean, they realise that this is a very shocking moment, and that as much as a very, very large proportion of the English population were in favour of, you know, parliamentary power and supported the parliamentarians in the Civil War, a very, very small number of people actually believed that the king could be put on trial, or that England should become a republic. So they absolutely knew how dangerous this was. It is quite interesting to sort of think about what happens in London, because, you know, throughout the 1640s, there's constant popular upheaval in London. There's, you know, there's protests, there's petitioning, there's riots, there's everything. And yet during the king's trial, there isn't. Now, one way that we can read this is that there's a whopping great army in the middle of London, and people don't want to you know, put their heads above the parapet. But another one is to say that, well, maybe London is broadly in support of putting the king on trial. And the regicides do later say, well, look, you know, we didn't just kill him in a corner. You know, think of Richard II. You know, think of think of medieval kings who were sort of murdered in castles and you know, outside the. We did it in public. We did it in the name of the people. And you know, it was, as I say, they reported on it. There was press reports. The execution was public. It was something which was done in the name of the people. The irony being that most of the people probably wouldn't have supported it.
The king is dead. We turn now to what comes next, which requires the Instruments of Government, written by a man named John Lambert, when we come back. The Blazing World, A New History of Revolutionary England, 1603 to 1689. Jonathan Healey is the author. It is now time to say the king is dead and not say long live the king. Parliament has choices to make, and a man named John Lambert writes Instruments of Government, in which, from his understanding of the violence of the age, he looks to a way of guaranteeing the power of the people through Parliament. But he names a man, Lord Protector, who is Oliver Cromwell. Thomas Fairfax, the general of the New Model Army, has stepped away and will not participate in the parliamentary debates. But Oliver Cromwell steps forward. And Jonathan, you write that Cromwell's 5 years in power thanks to Lambert's design, can be regarded as successful, noting the massacres in Ireland, noting some of the inconsistencies about Cromwell. Is that the opinion of Cromwell here in the 21st century in England? That Cromwell had his weaknesses, but there was strength in his rule?
Well, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, it's hard to argue that there isn't strength. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's a good thing or anything like that. When you consider what the situation was in 1649, where England had shockingly brutally murdered its monarch, if you want to take the line of what a lot of people in Europe would have thought at the time.
All the kings in Europe were appalled.
Yeah, absolutely. It's only Switzerland which sort of sends us kind of, congratulations, because Switzerland is a republic, but everyone else is horrified. And then, of course, you've got rebellion in Ireland. You've got the Scots are still on the side of the royalists, and yet from that, using sort of sheer willpower and military skill, he is able to create stability. So I mean, in those terms, it's a success. He dies in his bed, which is an astonishing achievement given how many people he's annoyed. But then it could have been, it sort of could have been so much more. I mean, he does it by moving away from and essentially kind of facing down, betraying, if you like, the levelers and the more radical democratic side of the republic. He even betrays Lambert, although the reasons for that are sort of quite defensible, in the sense that when Lambert writes the Instrument of Government in 1653, it's quite a sensible written constitution with constitutional protections for certain religious freedom for Protestants at least, and provision for regular parliaments. There are checks and balances written into the constitution, which is not a very English thing to do, but fundamentally Lambert's constitution comes from the military. Lambert is a soldier. He's a very intelligent soldier. He's a very principled soldier. He's a very cultured soldier, but he's a soldier. And for a lot of parliamentarians, that military side to the protectorate initially is anathema. And what they want to do is they want to create a constitution whereby Cromwell rules through the sovereignty of the people. So it's a rule which has been offered to him by Parliament. And what they do in 1657 is they say, well, okay, we'll make you king. We'll offer you the crown, but it won't be like the old crown, because it hasn't been given to him by God. It's been given to him by Parliament. Parliament have said you will become king. So it's a monarchy it's a monarchy based on popular sovereignty. But the irony is that Cromwell looks at it and says, well, God has told me that monarchy should fall. I will not pick up that which has been cast into the dust. He believes that the monarchy has been spoken against by God through providence. So he refuses it. But he then accepts a modified constitution where it comes from Parliament, and then Lambert is left on the sidelines. But it's that inability, I suppose, that of the Republic to kind of find a lasting solution. And probably when it does, which is in 1657, it's angered a lot of the army. It's angered a lot of the sort of democratic left, if you like, and the royalists are never going to support Cromwell. So it just basically ends up depending on the personality of Cromwell. He's the only person who can hold all these different factions together. So when he dies, it all falls apart.
Importantly to say that Cromwell is not hands-off government. In fact, he's a Puritan who imposes Puritan values on the people, and that is a great weakness on his part.
Yeah, well, it's certainly unpopular, I think.
Have about 30 seconds. Did he cancel Christmas, or is that a...
No, he didn't. No, he didn't. The celebration of religious services in Christmas had been banned by Parliament, but Cromwell didn't bring it back. But he didn't say, he wasn't the one who cancelled it, although he's remembered for that in England today.
Yes, the book is The Blazing World, A New History of Revolutionary England, 1603 to 1689. Jonathan Healey is the author. The themes, the arguments, the statements, the risks, all here in the 17th century. that will be echoed by the founding fathers in the 18th century in America. And much of the contest today between the people and their representatives, and in America, the president, we can see very much consistent with the doubts and the dreams of the men who led to a regicide, the cutting off of the head, Charles I, and then to the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, a farmer from East Anglia, who dies in September of 1659, 58, I believe, 1658. And the question of succession is not present. At some point, they figured maybe his eldest son, Richard. That didn't work out because Richard turned out to be a very friendly, popular person, but no Lord Protector. So now we turn to Parliament. Who is to be next? And Jonathan, this is a fascination because everything that was enforced during Parliament's time, during Oliver Cromwell's time, and before by the Puritans, now is to be tossed out with the bathwater. Everything is to go out again. And Charles II, who's been living in exile, comes back. The first thought I have is, why did they invite him back? Did they know the risk they were taking? Was it more important to them to take that risk than it was to come up with a new form of government?
I think what had happened basically was that after Cromwell died, as you say, there is this sort of period of a year and a half of political chaos where you have one, the army, you have parliament, you have different factions within parliament, you have different types of parliament, and then eventually it's a faction within the army led by a guy called George Monk, who marches down from Scotland, from Coldstream on the Scottish borders to London. And even, when he gets to London, nobody quite knows which way he's going to go. And eventually it becomes a sort of almost as like a last resort, really, is to say to the exiled Prince Charles or Charles Stuart, come over and form a government. We'll call a parliament, we'll invite you, and that becomes the sort of last attempt to create stability, which is what Cromwell had finally managed to create after 1657. It all fallen apart when he died. So the Restoration is, some people kind of interpret it as a sort of a return to sort of jollity and everything, but actually it's more about stability. It's more about getting away from the political chaos of 1659 specifically and early 1660. And then what comes back with the Restoration is when a lot of the old royalists are now in positions of power. It's interesting what they don't restore, and they don't. When I talked earlier about the reforms of 1641. So things like, banning ship money, getting rid of the Court of Star Chamber, for example, which is sort of arbitrary absolutist court. A lot of these things actually they stay for the Restoration. These reforms are carried forward. And it so much so that whereas before the Civil War, something like 40% of English tax came from Parliament. By after the Civil War, it was 90%. So it's a huge change in the way that the state is financed. It's become, parliamentary power is still much greater. But the big thing the big sort of thing where there is a sort of huge pendulum swing away from the Republic is in religion. And in the 1660s, the Anglican church reasserts itself very, 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 very forcefully, pushing dissenters, Presbyterians, Quakers, who of course have sprung up in the 1650s, all the sort of the more sort of radical groups are all pushed to the sidelines, and lots of those end up being imprisoned or migrating away to the Americas.
What we have then is the king restored. There is to be revenge. It happens across the country. The part of the revenge that I found most amazing, overwhelming, there are all kinds of facts in here that you go, they did? They dug up Cromwell's grave and hanged his corpse at Charing Cross. Is that where they hanged him?
He was... That's a good question, actually. I think he was outside. I think he was hanged outside Westminster, yes, actually. Westminster. So yeah,
yes, it's grotesque. And Jonathan, tells me this.
It's horrible. Yes,
this is something that I asked about, and Jonathan has an explanation. Where's his grave? Does he have a grave today?
Well, no, he was his body was tossed into an unmarked grave outside well, next to Westminster Abbey. There's a church called St Margaret's, which is now the Parliamentary Church. A beautiful 16th century church, and he was sort of tossed into an unmarked grave there, and his head somehow ended up back at his Cambridge college. It was, very, very much the tradition to give money to your old Cambridge college or your old parish back in at this point. And but this was a rather sort of grotesque version of that. But and it's still in Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge. I believe the fellows or a small group of the fellows know its precise location, but his head is buried in their garden somewhere.
Which represents the opinion of the royalists for the Puritans who ruled for 5 years, but we're now into a restoration under a very different personality than Charles I. I don't want to characterize Charles II as lighthearted, anything like that, because there was lots of cruelty in his reign. But in any event, he was a man who was interested in the pleasures of being king and not war fighting and not being a political actor. You say that 90% of his money now came from Parliament, but I think he did very well. He didn't have to scrabble for money the way his father did. Is that correct?
Yes, and one thing he does is he's relatively successful about not getting involved in wars, although there are a couple of fights with the Dutch. But also he's very lucky in that amongst that revenue, technically it comes from Parliament, but they tend to grant it for the whole. They grant it for the whole reign, so it's he doesn't have to keep going back to Parliament. Is the customs and excise, and the customs in particular, which is tax on imports and exports, is growing massively because in the later 17th century, the trading world that England is part of is expanding, and obviously a very, very large part of that is the expansion of what becomes the British Empire, and so things like the East India Company are bringing in lots and lots of money. The Royal African Company, of course, which is the first English, the sort of first massive English involvement in the trade of enslaved Africans, is making the crown a lot of money at this point. So there are various things that Charles II is able to rely upon, which don't involve going back to Parliament. But I think your characterization is right. I mean, in some ways, he's quite a successful politician because he manages to sort of hold things together. He's got some good. He's got some good politicians around him. There are some effective operators, but also he enjoys the theatre. He has a vibrant life at court. He's a patron of science and the arts, all those kind of things. So he's definitely a sort of a more light-hearted character than his father or indeed Cromwell, and a very, very interesting character, just a fascinating historical figure.
One of the joys of Jonathan's book is Margaret Cavendish, and we're going to explain the title, The Blazing World. Well, I immediately saw if I could buy a copy of the book from an ancient bookseller. No, I can't find one. You're very lucky to have read it. She wrote an addendum, as I understand it was an addendum to her work. She was a scientific thinker at the time, and she wrote a story about, and you characterize it as science fiction. I don't know how else we'd say it. You go to the North Pole and you connect to another planet and you make yourself empress. What was her inspiration, Jonathan?
Well, there'd already been a couple of books about societies in the moon, one of which was published in 1641 by a guy who became master of Wadham College in Oxford, I think, and a sort of leading scientific figure. So that kind of genre is already there. She's obviously very interesting because she's a woman as well, and for women to print. I mean, women had a very kind of elite women had a very kind of vibrant sort of manuscript culture at this point. But for her to write things in print and have them printed, and particularly sort of poetry and fiction, all these kind of things, was seen as quite sort of quite startling at the time. But she was, I mean, she was very much part of the titled royalist elite. She was, you know, she was a duchess, as high as you get. Married to a great sort of royalist duke, the Duke of Newcastle, and as a result of which she was able to sort of gain access to the Royal Society in London. She was able to sort of go to a special lecture, and there's this kind of rather sort of sniffy description of it by Samuel Pepys, who is completely fascinated by her because she is this kind of really flamboyant character in London who travels around the city in this kind of elaborate sort of elaborate coach with these kind of really kind of elaborate costumes, and Pepys is fascinated by her. But then she comes along to the Royal Society, and they do a demonstration for her, and according to Pepys, she's sort of completely overwhelmed by it, and then sort of, you know, goes back. But the context is that in that demonstration were people like Robert Boyle, who she had criticized in print. So she's not only a sort of a fascinating woman writer by her own in her own way, but she's also someone who is happy to criticize the sort of great luminaries of the scientific world, and it's very, very interesting. And the book The Blazing World is fascinating because you can read it in lots and lots of different ways, and my reading is it's a sort of, you know, it's also sort of almost sort of kind of ecological feminism in a way. And you know, one of the things that she has is that basically when this planet is ruled by this empress, they come over to England, and they use all this new technology that they have to conquer the world. And it's sort of, you know, it's almost a kind of parable about the dangers of technology being used to dominate. But yeah, it's mad. I mean, if you do read it, I'd love to know what you think, because it's a very strange but it's very sort of characteristic of a period where people are really sort of thinking about power. They're thinking about the importance of science. They're thinking about colonialism as a sort of early colonialism, and not really knowing what to think about it, being very ambivalent.
The book is The Blazing World, for Margaret Cavendish's genius in the 17th century, a new history of revolutionary England, 1603 to 1689. James II, the younger brother of Charles II, decides somewhere in the 1660s to convert to Catholicism, perhaps surrounded by Catholics on the mainland, knowing that if he was ever to ascend to the throne, this would introduce contretemps again into his native land. Well, here it is. The moment that we can anticipate, there is rumors that James is converted, but with the death of his brother, this is in the 1680s. The death of his brother, James I, becomes the King of England. And he's been leader of the fleet. He's had charge. He's a very good warrior, very good combat leader. But he resigns from the Navy because he won't swear. He won't take an oath that would reveal that would violate his Catholicism. And Jonathan, I come to this because James II is a less well-known figure, Charles II, the Restoration. James II had to know he was introducing trouble. Did he believe, knowing all of that, knowing how few Catholics there were in the country, that he could be successful? He wasn't preaching tolerance. He was switching out Protestants for Catholics in important roles.
It's a very good question. I don't think we'll ever know the answer to that. He probably believed that the monarchy by that point was in enough of a strong position because of the financial strength that it had, that it could basically do what it wanted. And I think what he underestimated was not only the kind of anti-Catholicism, but also the sort of parliamentary constitutionalism, which by this point had become much more ingrained, I think. And a lot of the things that go wrong with James II's reign are not necessarily to do with his Catholicism as such. They are to do with the way that Catholicism problematizes his relationship with Parliament. But actually, I think to understand James II, we need to take a step back but to the moment at the end of Charles II, his brother's reign, when it becomes clear that James is, he was then Duke of York, it becomes clear that James is a Catholic. And in Parliament, there is a movement to exclude him from the throne. So Parliament basically passes an act, or the idea is that Parliament will pass an act, and the act will change the succession to the throne. Now, out of this comes two things that we've not really seen in England at this point before, which are political parties, obviously still with us today. At this point, the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs believe that Parliament has the power to change the succession. The Tories believe that it doesn't. And they both have religious connotations as well. The Whigs are more are anti-Catholic, and they're more sympathetic to dissent, Protestant dissent. The Tories are anti-dissenter, and they're slightly more sympathetic to Catholics, although only slightly. And out of that crisis, there's a sort of a kind of 4-year period where there is political chaos, and a lot of people think that England is about to fall into another civil war. There's this kind of fear of 41 again. 41 has come again, and eventually the monarchy is able to sort of close ranks, and by making an alliance with the Tories, the monarchy is able to survive. James isn't excluded from the throne. The Whigs are defeated, and you get this kind of period of repression known as the Tory reaction. But the outcome of that is that when Charles II does finally die in 1685, the monarchy is no longer this kind of all-encompassing, force for stability, which has united different factions, as it had to a point been in 1660. It's now much more factional. It is a monarchy which is aligned with one side of a very fractious political debate between Whigs and Tories. And the mistakes that James makes is that in order to cozy up to the Catholics, he alienates his natural supporters, the Tories, so that by 1688, both Tories and Whigs have decided that James needs to be checked. He needs to be challenged, and the way they do that is that 7 of them write a letter inviting William of Orange, who's another grandson of Charles I, to come over to England and sort things out. Now, what does that mean at this point? Nobody quite knows. But when he comes over, it becomes clear that eventually he actually wants the throne to himself.
Because James's second wife delivers a boy, that means that Parliament must act, because there's an heir now that would remain Catholic, that would mean that the kingdom would remain Catholic. And
yes, to Protestants in England, it's a bit of a pain that the king is a kind of ardent Catholic, but because he's in his 50s, which at this point is quite old, they assume that his reign is not going to last very long, but that when he has a healthy son, then obviously that son will be brought up as a Catholic, so it becomes perpetual.
And William of Orange sets sail with 500 ships, and he lands on the 5th of November. So yes. Who's writing this drama, Jonathan?
Yes, and it's not even deliberate. The initial plan, the initial plan had been to sail north, but the winds had stopped him. So he was, it was. I mean, if you wanted to read a sort of, providential reading of the 17th century, where it's all being orchestrated by, by God, then I think you'd have a
remember the 5th of November. James quite sensibly flees and doesn't make the mistake of standing trial, because, as Jonathan writes, the parliamentarians had the same steel in their hands that they did in 1649. William and Mary are now the regents, the Protestant regents in London, and all is well in the kingdom by the sea until the next century. Jonathan Healey, the book is The Blazing World, A New History of Evolutionary England. This is where America came from, 1603 to 1689. I'm John Batchelor.